Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality. I'm your host, Doc Bach, here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists, and today we're continuing our series on obsessive compulsive personality. Now, OCPD often overlaps with just about every other personality disorder. So today we are going to unpack the various ways this personality presents by looking at the 6 subtypes according to Dr. Theodore Millon. Let's dive in. So if you've just joined us on this series, here's a quick recap of OCPD. It is a long-lasting pattern of extreme preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental and interpersonal control at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency. It has to be present by early adulthood and permeates lots of areas of life. So it doesn't just show up one day, and it's not just present during college finals week. It is intertwined with who you are as a person.
Right. And then you need to demonstrate at least 4 of 8 criteria. Criteria include being hyper detail oriented, pathologically perfectionistic, excessively work focused, inflexible, rigid, hoarding, controlling, financially stingy, and stubborn.
Yes. Yep. So to those with OCPD, they are so obsessed with the details that they actually move in the opposite direction of their actual goals. So they miss the forest for the trees, and the initial task may not even get accomplished. But that said, extreme perfectionism and rigidity can be valuable sometimes. And in Western culture, we often tend to reinforce such traits to be at an unhealthy level.
So the first thing that actually comes to my mind is graduate school. So you have to be pretty perfectionistic, detail-oriented, controlled, and excessively work-focused.
Yes.
So maybe school, jobs, the medical field, anywhere where we're managing multiple areas of life, it can require that type A workaholism that our society rewards.
Absolutely. Yeah. So an example of that, I recently cleaned out my old inbox from graduate school timeframe, and reading my old emails, I was quite embarrassed at my own compulsivity. I think I was probably the most compulsive in that time frame because I had to be. Like, it kept me from getting in trouble. It helped me remember the 5 trillion things the professors wanted, all the while trying to be the perfect little new psychologist or psychologist in training that I could be.
Yeah, I actually have data from Millon's testing measures that my own compulsivity has gradually decreased as I age and get farther away from school, right? And my defensive, put my best foot forward presentation isn't needed as much.
Yeah. So I don't have the concrete data to support my hypothesis necessarily, other than my emails, which isn't really concrete data, but it's something. But as I'm even saying this, I'm going, hold on, is cleaning out my inbox a compulsive behavior in and of itself?
It can be. It depends on the motive. I don't know. But you know what else is interesting?
What's that?
Is that Millon actually said compulsive has been seen to combine with almost all other personality types. Maybe a couple exceptions that he noted, like antisocial and borderline, which I might disagree with. I think all personality types can have a compulsive component.
Yeah, that fits with what I've seen clinically, definitely. As we've talked about in this series so far, I often see what I call a compulsive shell, but I've never actually seen someone with true OCPD at the core, at least not in outpatient private practice. So the extreme rigidity, perfectionism, and the need for control are often in the compulsive shell, kind of the outer layer of the personality, and that serves to hide the real pathology underneath. Again, at least in cases that I've seen. And you know, what's interesting is I have actually seen it in borderline personality many times. So I disagree with Millon there too.
Right. I think that compulsive shell can be part of any personality, including antisocial, because I'm thinking, for example, a healthy antisocial can feel guilt and attempt to undo anger by cleaning or making up for it. A pathological antisocial can have murderous rituals.
Oh, my word. Absolutely. Like washing or cleaning a body that they just dismembered.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. But then An impulsive borderline, right? They can also focus on keeping their schooling excessively organized and put together.
Yeah, to hide their own feelings of like falling apartness on the inside.
Mhm.
I have definitely seen that in clinical work. So sometimes the compulsivity is like the one aspect that they can control. And again, it shields the darker parts on the inside.
And that said, a compulsive personality core with the antisocial shell wouldn't fit very well. And
Mm-mm.
then a compulsive with an impulsive borderline shell, like that kind of defeats the purpose.
Mm-mm.
Maybe that's what Millon's talking about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think with the compulsive shell, the darker personality piece, that's what's suppressed is the darker
Mm.
pieces. So then the compulsive shell is the shield, like the shiny, put together, distracting thing that society sees, because it doesn't make sense to put the darker personality on the outside for the world to see, but instead the
Mhm.
shiny, perfected piece is on the outside, right? Because you're not going to hide that. You're going to showcase it because it's reinforced in society. Like, so no matter the pathology, that's going to be the thing that's on the outside, I think.
And with that in mind, there are lots of flavors of OCPD because this personality blends with literally everything.
Yes.
Even Milan said that other subtypes are possible, but he only highlights 6. So, as
Okay.
a quick recap, Milan divides up his subtypes into 3 severity categories: mild, moderate, and severe. And then each category has 2 subtypes for a total of 6. So, let's start with mild.
Yeah. Okay. So the mild level is very, very common in successful societies. So there isn't as much rigidity and pathological perfectionism in this level, but rather a discipline and organized lifestyle that maybe enhances functioning. So there isn't really anxiety when things go awry, but there is discomfort. So mild level compulsives get things done correctly, deferring to authority and rules, as well as being loyal, moral, and hardworking. So, integrity is usually high, but they can be dichotomous in their thinking. So, what that means is like maybe thinking in black or white terms or more rigid terms, good or bad, like at the extremes.
Mm-hmm.
So, they devalue emotions too and tend to idealize logic. So Millon describes 2 mild level subtypes, and that is the conscientiously reliable subtype and the perfectionistically reliable subtype.
The first in the mild category is the conscientious, reliable personality, and it involves dependent features.
Mm.
So they're accommodating and duty bound, prudent, hardworking, yielding, circumspect, and acquiescent. They
Mm.
defer and submit to rules and authorities and other people's desires. They have difficulty with assertiveness then. On the outside, they can come across as modest, cooperative, and considerate, but this overlays deep feelings of inadequacy that leads to minimization of their own achievements and abilities.
Yes, because they fear making social mistakes. So if things aren't clear, they become indecisive and rigid due to self doubt. So this is where the dependent features are seen the most, as they are overly respectful, submissive, and self restrained, often saying anything to keep the peace and decrease anger from others, which then allows them to gain favor from powerful people.
Mhm.
However, this conflicts with their hidden, internal, intense, rebellious feelings that they have to constrain so tightly lest it come out uncontrolled. So, this leads to anxiety, over organization, rigidity, inflexibility, and isolation from these unacceptable emotions. So they find it difficult to handle disruptions to routines and expectations, and they find structure outside of the self, often with religion or other institutions, which then they're being pedantic towards others to distract from what's actually happening inside of them.
Yes, and Milan said it best that they operate under the premise of what can I do to prevent others from seeing how empty and shallow I am? Like, what can I do to make sure that no one sees beneath my surface proprieties to the obnoxious and immoral impulses that I keep having inside of me?
Yes, this is so powerful. Love that. So, with compulsives, it is all about their own inner conflict because they are at odds with themselves and they are so far removed from their own darkness that they do the equal and opposite of those desires. So, if they rigidly adhere to religion, morals, and rules, it gives them a false sense of control and superiority. Like, oh, what? Who, me? Like, I'm not immoral, selfish, or messy. Like, but that's you over there, and I'm judging you for it.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Now, the second mild subtype is the perfectionistically reliable personality. That is more of a pure form of the compulsive personality, being meticulous, organized, pragmatic, diligent, cautious, and serious. And they need to seek clarity for anything ambiguous.
Hmm.
They dread taking risks and making mistakes, having a suppressed fear of failure, criticism, and disapproval, especially by those in an authority role. So their pathological perfection works to avoid criticism, which stems from feelings of inadequacy, and then exposure of deficits and unacceptable urges.
Yes. So basically, they focus on the tangible external stuff like rules so they can hide and suppress their internal fears and motivations. They adhere to a structured, kind of self created handbook for the good and just life, including perseverance, rigid positivity, and rejection of pleasure. So play is not acceptable. And there is a self imposed pressure to perform and achieve which can lead to negative consequences like being pedantic, close minded, rigid, insensitive to others' views, and just being cold and really lacking social warmth.
However, they actually can function fairly well with their practical, efficient manner, maybe just not in relationships because
Right.
they're chilly.
Hmm.
It's almost like they're lacking an inner child, but I think really what's happening is they're rejecting their inner child, perhaps like someone did to them when they were growing up.
Wow, this is fascinating. Yeah, so Freud would actually say that these types have an overactive superego that rejects the id impulses or the inner child completely. So perhaps therapy would focus on getting back in touch with the messy, childlike parts of the self.
But that's not why they show up to therapy. So
No.
addressing that can take a lot of time.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's hard to admit, especially at more pathological levels, because healing involves letting go of the compulsivity. So I'll self disclose here. I have a big compulsive piece to my personality. It's not my core, which we will get to on another day. We haven't covered it yet. But in my healing journey through something called internal family systems, I learned to let my creativity drive the bus. So now my conscientiousness and creativity kind of take turns driving instead of my inner child being put in the backseat of the car, restrained in a car seat.
I love that. That
Yeah.
is beautiful growth.
Yes, yes. The model that I was living in wasn't working for me at all, but it's who I thought I had to be as a professional woman, as a psychologist. But it's just not true. And I didn't really keep the two parts separate until graduate school when my compulsivity really showed up. So I had to undo some things that were reinforced by my profession and by my training.
Yeah. And for me, adding a child to my life transformed that hidden inner child to the back of the car to like a clown bus.
It's not even a car, it's a bus.
It's a ridiculous amount of chaos.
Yeah.
And that did not help with compulsivity.
Yeah.
I learned really quick to let it go. Otherwise, I would be overwhelmed and distressed constantly.
Absolutely. Let go of the spilled Cheerios, the messy meltdowns. Like, it's okay. But for more severe compulsives, they can't let it go. So the inner conflict continues to boil, and it never resolves. But before I keep going down bunny trails, let's look at how these two subtypes are slightly different because their nuance here is important.
I was thinking it almost feels like the perfectionistically reliable subtype is more self focused, while the conscientious reliable subtype is more other focused.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So the perfectionistic reliable type seems more concerned with perfecting the self, to be above criticism. But the conscientiously reliable is really focused on deference to others to appear a certain way socially. So it's like a conscientious fawn response, like, yes, person, anything for you, person. Like, look how good I am. I'm the exemplar, right? So speaking to my Enneagram lovers here for a sec, the perfectionistic reliable is more like a self-pres type one, whereas the conscientiously reliable is more like a social one. So perfecting the self versus appealing to the masses as the paragon of perfection.
You got it. So let's move to the moderate level. So if the reliable personalities are able to fit into society, what actually causes them to regress to more problematic levels? It's when conforming gets too stressful and then the constriction becomes total.
Wow.
Kind of like a Chinese finger trap. Like the more you pull, the more your fingers get stuck. The more compulsive they become, the more that they become compulsive because the cycle is reinforcing.
Yeah. So because their constraint or compulsivity is successful, they use it more and more, but then they can't release their own inner tensions. But of course, the tension, as we know, it has to go somewhere, right? So this is where it can show up in the body, like in bodily aches and pains, or even conditions, like physical conditions. And it increases the likelihood of emotional outbursts too. Almost like you have a can of soda that's shaken up under pressure, then you twist off that top and it comes out, right? But let's talk about the two moderate level subtypes. So are you ready for Millon's vast vocabulary here?
Oh, here we go.
I know. All right. So we have the bureaucratically constricted and the parsimoniously constricted. So Doc Fish, enlighten us. What do these types look like?
The bureaucratically constricted personality involves narcissistic features. So maybe being high-handed, unimaginative, closed-minded, and then definitely like intrusive, nosy, meddlesome. So they align themselves with time-established institutions. That might be church, police, union, university, a company. And they do that to feel comfort and strength instead of oppression and anger, because belonging in a group helps their self-esteem and it supports their decisiveness and action. But the group has to have a structured framework. The guilt and anxiety stemming from their unacceptable but constrained impulses are dispelled by putting the responsibility of action like onto the organization, to which they then become very dependable and loyal to.
Yeah. They just do what they're told so they can't be punished or faulted. And voila, right? They are now protected, secure, and free to engage in their rigid role that they love. And it gives them a sense of purpose, identity, value. So they are no longer an individual with individual needs, right? Because remember, individual impulses are deemed bad. But now they are part of the system, which of course, this is going to bring in those narcissistic features because they find pride and self-importance in their belonging, but it's only surface level. It's not the core inner workings.
And this resonated with me not only for individual personality, but also the result of societal personality values. So here we go with Millon again. He had something that he apparently wanted to say. So he said, it is these petty-minded and trifling bureaucrats that often make dealing with public agencies so trying and tiresome.
Whoa, okay. So these are strong words from the usually neutral Millon.
Yeah. So, but I mean, have you ever tried calling a government agency? Like ever?
Right.
The DMV, the Prothonotari's office for like a name change, a divorce, an adoption.
Oh my gosh. Red tape in all of its glory, right? So some types actually thrive in this type of environment though. And at the moderate level, the compulsive personality type is one of them. It reminds me of Roz from Monsters, Inc., where she's like, you didn't file your paperwork. Like it's the pedantic stuff. Yeah, that automatically it's creating this othering, right? So the person that's enforcing the code or the rules, the law, like they're above it all, bossing you around. And that's the narcissistic piece here. So I understand why Millon was quite critical in his analysis of this type.
Yeah, and I think it leaks out of our culture.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, there's a different type that is more self-focused. So the parsimoniously constricted personality combines the compulsive personality with schizoid or avoidant features. And it's in line with Eric Fromm's hoarding orientation. So they place a protective wall between the self and the external world. And then inside that wall, they hold tight to their possessions to avoid any potential loss. That could involve money, possessions, privacy.
Yeah. So they don't try to take from others, they just protect their own stuff. So
Mhm.
perhaps in childhood, they had to find a little space that was safe from parental restriction, and they protect it against all intrusion, which is the schizoid piece. So they
Mhm.
are hyper vigilant about others taking their resources. So they often avoid others. And then in that dynamic, we can overlap with the avoidant features.
Yes, but Millon notes there's a deeper reason for this personality to protect against intrusion, and that is so their internal emptiness, their rebellious desires, and their anger are not exposed.
Hmm.
So he states respect is a way of maintaining distance, then a means of hiding what the rigid types must keep from themselves and from others. So this is the strong schizoid and avoidant piece. Like it's not just hoarding the resources, it's also burying the desires along with the hoard.
Yeah.
It's putting up a wall, but it's not actually having the detachment of the schizoid.
Right. Yeah. So Milan actually talks about a case of a woman named Jane who worked a boring accounting job that allowed her to hoard financial resources. So she was no nonsense. She didn't socialize at work or outside of work. She walked 2 miles to work to save the money, which she
Mhm.
hoarded in a safe in her basement. And she would only open a bank account, get this, after interviewing the president of the bank. So eventually, her sister had had enough and said, "You need to get into therapy." So she went, but unsurprisingly, only after her sister agreed to pay for it for her.
Sure.
Yeah. So super stingy, rigid, and resource hoarding. So this is a very different flavor than the bureaucratically constricted.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
bureaucratically constricted is your systems and red tape loving compulsive type with
Mhm.
narcissism features. They love enforcing rules on others at church, in politics, in
Yeah.
any system really that involves a rigid adherence to rules.
Yeah.
And this is in comparison to the parsimoniously constricted, who might be more machine like, self focused, and compartmentalized away from others, not necessarily detached though.
Yeah.
So they function with the mentality of like, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, and there's no need to cross that line.
It's a really interesting mantra. Yeah. Yeah. So, this again, in these subtypes, it sounds like a social versus like a self preservation instinctual focus, same as the mild types.
Mm-hmm.
But moving on to the severe, disorder level compulsive, what causes constricted personalities to fall into obsessive compulsive personality disorder territory?
Well, they have more and more difficulty controlling their own desire to be oppositional. So, because on the inside, remember, there's an inner rebel and they have a hard time holding it back. So, they can become extremely overwhelmed by their internal conflicts in the bedeviled compulsive subtype.
Ooh.
Or they can become even more constrained and rigid in the puritanical compulsive subtype.
Oh my goodness, Milan and his vocabulary again. So the puritanical compulsive personality integrates paranoid features, being cold, self righteous, and constrained, yet also super conforming to authority because they fear condemnation. So inside, they have unacceptable urges and fantasies that they fear that they will be punished for. And it actually feeds their insecurity. So they suppress them. But this results in an internal boiling pot of resentment, disillusionment, hostility, and anger. So they want to release this, obviously, but they fear rejection and punishment. So this results in a conflict that sometimes can come out in psychosomatic symptoms, like again, bodily aches, pains, physical conditions.
Yeah, and it does ooze out like that resentment and anger.
Yeah.
It does leak through. It leaks out in angry outbursts and behaviors such as being argumentative, critical, fault finding, and judgmental,
Yeah.
punishing others and rationalizing any guilt with morality and self-righteousness.
Mm.
However, they can also address the conflict through like a counter move by engaging in ritualistic moral behaviors and rigidly constraining their life and functioning to minimize risk of disapproval, failure, and punishment from authorities.
Yeah. So, what would these ritualistic behaviors look like in this type at the severe level?
It could be religious or cult orientated behaviors. They can be prude, perhaps with morality, living for the purpose of whatever organization they align with.
Okay. So, you're talking about like extreme control over others, like maybe even vigilantism, but all the while submitting to an organization or an authority.
Right. So they don't relax and they're super tense, denying and defending against any of their emotional problems.
Mm.
They're also self punitive and self deprecating. So they fluctuate with their punishment being either internal or external, right? Like on the self or on others.
Okay.
And then that's flavored with the paranoid features. So the paranoid suspicion, irritability, bigotry, zealousness, and harsh judgment of others.
Yeah.
It's a paranoid attitude of like get or be gotten. So even though they are self-righteous and moral, they can actually behave terroristically and violently because they can be convinced by authorities that this is a higher moral ground.
Holy smokes. I can see how this type would follow like the perfect cult or extremist script, like do the thing, check the box, lead the people, punish the people, and then punish the self, because they switch between being a perpetrator and a victim, almost like a kamikaze situation where they destroy the self and others at the same time.
Yeah. So Millon said they can become harsh and stern disciplinarians, fault-finding and moralistic prudes. Not only must they prove others to be wrong and immoral, but they judge them as deserving punishment. Because others are seen as sinners and perpetrators of immoral acts, they can justly be condemned without guilt. Justice requires a punitive attitude, morality sanctions it. Hence, puritanical compulsives who feared condemnation in the past now become merciless condemners.
Oh my.
So once concerned with just treatment for themselves, they now become the perpetrators of injustice.
Oh my. Yeah. So they use projection to put their own sinfulness and badness onto the other, which justifies their need to condemn and persecute the other, thereby acting out their own aggressive, sadistic, yet rejected impulses, and then washing their hands of it in the name of vigilante justice or moral superiority.
Yeah, this is a very other-oriented subtype. So then next we have a more self-focused subtype. The Bedeviled Compulsive personality combines with negativistic features with a core internal conflict of a need to comply or defy. So in compliance, they appear properly controlled and push down any oppositional desires in self-denial. Sometimes this works, but sometimes it doesn't. Internally, though, they're anxious and confused and indecisive, not knowing what they want or who they are. So then they procrastinate, they chase their tail, they mull over desires and thoughts. So they never actually end up making a decision or doing a task. They just kind of spin their wheels.
Okay. So the bedeviled type looks compliant on the outside most of the time, but they actually display defiance out of their own indecision, which leads to obstinance and rigid immovability. So nothing gets done because they reject their inner urges and badness so strongly that it makes them incredibly stuck. Like vacations are forfeited, pleasures are denied. Sometimes they succeed at the suppression, like a tried and true compulsive would, but sometimes they don't. And that bitter, negativistic, chip on the shoulder attitude can come out. So this is a constant conflict internally, like above and beyond the typical ambivalent conflict of the compulsive, like especially at disorder level here.
And what makes this type more severe is that they feel tormented, like holding a heavy pressure to oblige others, yet doubting the self. They've maybe lost their internal compass and grounding, so the compulsivity doesn't actually work.
Wow.
It starts to break. It's unable to contain the extreme ambivalence when coupled with the negativistic personality. So like seeps through the cracks and it can lead to their undoing.
Absolutely. And the inner conflict and stuckness actually can lead to a breakdown in their identity at severe levels because they don't know who they are or what they want. But yet again, they can appear very put together and compliant on the outside, but in a rigid and compulsive way, and then disguising their own internal breakdown. So this creates an awful and impossible cycle of doing the compliant, socially forward thing on the outside, but inside they can't seem to get a grasp on their own identity, desires, and beliefs. So you have these two huge forces working in equal opposition, like be more and more compliant socially and move further and further away from their true self. And then this can lead to exhaustion, tantrums, malcontentment as well. So Millon actually stated about this, there's a feeling of being overwhelmed against both one's will and one's better knowledge.
Oh, wow. They move in one way, but resist movement altogether at the same time.
Yep.
And I imagine this leads to exhaustion and overwhelm and probably confusion and really self-torture.
Yes.
They sometimes don't feel they deserve the good things in life, like a vacation or anything positive that exists in their fantasies.
Yeah.
All this internal chaos can lead to attempts to undo intense emotions that bedevil them through self-punishment.
Yeah.
So their outlets are then obsessions and compulsions.
So then when urges do break through conscious awareness, they deny and reject it so hard that they can blame it on non-reality things, like being possessed by the devil or demons. So in a way, they can feel like they're on the edge of psychosis because it is a complete rejection that those thoughts or desires actually exist inside of them. It has to be coming from outside the self, another demonic dark force, right? Not part of them. So they see themselves as backsliding into corruption by letting these desires slip through.
Exactly. All right. So the main difference between the three levels is how that they blend into society.
Yeah.
And technically, any of these subtypes could be at any level of severity. But the more disconnected the compulsive becomes from their own core drives and desires, the more problematic the compulsive behavior and personality are, to the point where it destroys the self or others.
Absolutely. But as we've talked about in this series thus far, compulsive pieces are highly valued in our Western culture. And with that positive feedback loop, we have to be careful not to lose our core selves in the pursuit of morality or like being the good employee or professional or whatever it is, because losing touch with ourselves only leads to more problematic behavior, problematic outcomes, and of course, inner torment. All right, so today we unpack the 6 compulsive personality subtypes according to Millon. We hope you'll tune in for the rest of the series, so don't forget to like, subscribe. It does really, really help our channel out. And lastly, if you're a personality nerd like us, we've got blogs, visuals, and references that coincide with each episode at www.personalitycouch.com. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.